On the night of October 22nd, 1923, Governor Al Smith stood in the lobby of the brand-new Concourse Plaza Hotel in the Bronx and told the crowd, "After seeing this new structure, I am convinced that anything can go in the Bronx." He had reason to believe it. The hotel was 12 stories tall, 500 rooms, funded entirely by local businessmen who had sold 10,000 shares of stock to their neighbors. And it sat on a boulevard so grand that people in the crowd that night were already calling it the Champs-Élysées of New York. 50 years later, the Concourse Plaza was a welfare hotel, and the view from its upper floors was of burned-out buildings stretching in every direction. What happened between those two nights is the story of how a single infrastructure deal, one highway, one route, one man's refusal to move a line on a map, set off a chain of destruction so total that it turned an entire American borough into a synonym for ruin. But the destruction only matters if you understand what was there to destroy. And what was there for a few extraordinary decades was one of the most remarkable urban neighborhoods ever built in the United States. The Bronx is named for Jonas Bronk, a Swedish-born settler who purchased about 500 acres north of the Harlem River from the Dutch West India Company in 1639. For the next 2.5 centuries, the land that bore his name remained mostly rural, farms, estates, small villages supplying markets in Manhattan. As late as 1874, when the western portion was annexed to New York City, it was still a place of country roads and open fields. The eastern half followed in 1895, and when the 5 boroughs consolidated in 1898, the Bronx became the northernmost piece of the new city. It had about 200,000 people. It was, by any measure, a backwater. What changed everything was the subway. The Interborough Rapid Transit Company extended its first lines into the Bronx in the early 1900s, and the Jerome Avenue Elevated Line opened in 1917. Suddenly, Manhattan's crowded tenements were 40 minutes from open land where a builder could put up a new apartment building without first tearing down an old one. And builders came. The population of the Bronx doubled between 1900 and 1910, reaching 431,000. It doubled again by 1920, passing 732,000. By 1930, it had reached 1,265,000. A 6-fold increase in 3 decades. No borough in New York had ever grown that fast. If the Bronx had been its own city, it would have been the 6th largest in the United States. The physical infrastructure built to serve that growth was staggering in its ambition. And the centerpiece, the boulevard that would define the borough's identity for the next half-century, was the Grand Concourse. It was the vision of a single man. Louis Aloys Ries was a French immigrant from Saint-Avold in Lorraine who had become the chief engineer of street improvements for what was then still part of Westchester County. In 1890, he conceived of a grand boulevard to connect Manhattan with the northern Bronx. His model was the Champs-Élysées, but he wanted something bigger. The Grand Boulevard and Concourse, as it was formally named, would be 180 feet wide, broader than any avenue in Manhattan, divided into 3 separate roadways by tree-lined medians, with generous sidewalks and bicycle paths. Construction began in 1894. The concourse opened to traffic on November 25, 1909, stretching 4 miles from 161st Street north to Mosholu Parkway. An extension absorbed Mott Avenue in 1927, pushing it south to 138th Street. Ries had designed a road. What the Bronx built along it was a civilization. The year the Concourse Plaza Hotel opened its doors, 1923, was also the year Yankee Stadium rose on River Avenue, just down the hill at 161st Street. They opened within months of each other. The stadium on April 18th, the hotel on October 22nd. And together they became the twin anchors of a neighborhood that radiated prosperity in every direction. Babe Ruth hit a home run on Yankee Stadium's opening day against the Red Sox, and the press promptly christened it the house that Ruth built. The players themselves often stayed at the Concourse Plaza. Joe Gordon, who came up with the Yankees in 1938, later remembered walking to the ballpark with 6 or 8 teammates who all lived in the hotel with their wives. The Concourse Plaza's grand ballroom held more than 2,000 people. It hosted bar mitzvahs, weddings, political rallies. Franklin Roosevelt campaigned there. Harry Truman campaigned there. When John F. Kennedy arrived for a campaign stop on November 5, 1960, the hotel greeted him with a banner that read, "The home of the Knishes thinks Jack is delicious." Opening night, a single room had cost $3. A double was $4.50. Even by the standards of 1923, it was a bargain, because the Bronx was not selling luxury. It was selling arrival. And that was the key to understanding everything the Grand Concourse became. It was not Park Avenue. It was what Park Avenue meant to people who could not afford Park Avenue. Jewish families fleeing the tenements of the Lower East Side, Italian immigrants moving north from East Harlem, Irish families from Hell's Kitchen. They came to the Bronx because the new apartment buildings along the Concourse offered something that most of them had never experienced: space, light, central heating, private bathrooms. In 1934, nearly 99% of Bronx residences had private bathrooms, and 95% had central heating. Those numbers were higher than any other borough in New York. Moving to the Grand Concourse was a declaration that you had made it, not to wealth exactly, but to the American middle class. The 1939 WPA Guide to New York City called it the Park Avenue of middle-class Bronx residents, and noted that the lease to an apartment in one of its many large buildings is considered evidence of at least moderate business success. The apartments themselves were extraordinary. Starting in the late 1920s and accelerating through the Depression, when developers found they could build cheaply on vacant Bronx lots without the demolition costs of Manhattan, architects filled the Grand Concourse with some of the finest Art Deco and Art Moderne residential buildings in the country. By the mid-1930s, nearly 300 apartment buildings lined the boulevard and its surrounding streets. The architect Jacob Felsen alone designed more than 40 of them. They featured terrazzo floors in geometric patterns, brass-trimmed lobbies, glass block windows, setbacks and zigzags that created dozens of corners where light flooded in. The buildings were 5 and 6 stories high, set back from the street behind landscaped entrance courts with hedges and shrubs. The effect, walking the concourse in 1937 or 1938, was of a neighborhood that had been designed not merely to house people, but to dignify them. Walk into one of those lobbies in 1936 and the floors would be polished to a mirror sheen, the mailboxes gleaming, the elevator operator nodding as you passed. The apartments themselves were designed with a thoughtfulness that later decades of housing would mostly abandon. The bathroom was positioned next to the bedroom for convenience. The kitchen was a galley off to the side to contain cooking smells, and every room was angled to catch the maximum light. Rents were modest. A spacious 2-bedroom with a sunken living room and parquet floors might go for $60 or $70 a month. For families who had grown up 4 to a room on the Lower East Side with a shared toilet in the hallway, these apartments were not just housing, they were proof. The neighborhood around the concourse was equally alive. East Tremont Avenue, the borough's longest thoroughfare, ran from the Harlem River clear to the East River, and its storefronts turned over with the brisk rhythm of a commercial street that served a growing population. The Bronx had its own newspapers, its own political clubs, its own social hierarchies. There were labor halls and synagogues and social clubs where families gathered on weeknights. On summer evenings, residents sat on the wide concourse sidewalks and watched the traffic pass on Reese's triple roadway, the center lanes for through traffic, the outer lanes for local stops, while children played in the median parks. It was, by any honest accounting, a functioning urban civilization built almost from scratch in the span of a single generation. The cultural infrastructure matched the architecture. On September 7, 1929, The Lowe's Paradise Theater opened at 2403 Grand Concourse, a 4,000-seat movie palace designed by John Eberson, who had built more than 500 atmospheric theaters across the country and considered this one his masterpiece. The Paradise cost $4 million. Its interior was designed to make the audience feel they were sitting outdoors in the courtyard of a Baroque Italian palace. Artificial trees and plantings lined the walls. Plaster birds perched on carved balustrades, and the ceiling displayed a precise rendering of the January constellations, the birth sign of Marcus Lowe himself, with mechanical stars that twinkled and a cloud machine that sent wisps of simulated vapor drifting overhead. Crystal chandeliers hung in the lobby. Marble columns flanked a grand staircase. It was the second largest auditorium in New York City, smaller only than Radio City Music Hall. On the Grand Concourse, where local zoning forbade large vertical signs, the exterior was restrained, cream-colored terracotta and marble, a mechanical clock on the facade. The restraint only made the interior more astonishing. For 2 decades, generations of Bronx families lined up on Saturday nights to enter what amounted to a working-class cathedral of entertainment. This was the Bronx at its peak, a borough that in 1950 held 1,451,000 people, a place with its own grand boulevard, its own legendary stadium, its own movie palace with a fake sky, its own hotel where presidents came to campaign, its own architectural style that expressed a specific idea about what ordinary American life could look like. It was not glamorous in the way Manhattan was glamorous. It was something arguably more interesting. It was aspirational in the way only a place built by immigrants can be, where every terrazzo floor and every brass doorknob said, "This is what we came here for." And then a man who had never lived in the Bronx drew a line through the middle of it. Robert Moses held more simultaneous positions of public authority than perhaps any unelected figure in American history. By the late 1940s, he was New York City's construction coordinator, the chairman of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, a member of the City Planning Commission, and the Parks Commissioner, among other titles. He had built Jones Beach, the Triborough Bridge, the West Side Highway, Lincoln Center. He had reshaped more of New York's physical landscape than any single person before or since. He was brilliant, relentless, and profoundly indifferent to the human cost of construction. He had built 627 miles of roads in and around New York City. He never learned to drive a car. Moses operated by a method refined over 3 decades. He would announce a project, secure initial funding before opposition could organize, begin construction on the least controversial section first to establish momentum, and then present the remaining sections as inevitable. The money was committed, the work was underway. To stop now would be to waste what had already been spent. He staffed his agencies with engineers and lawyers who answered to him, not to elected officials. He controlled toll revenue from his bridges and tunnels, which gave him a funding stream independent of the city budget. And he cultivated a public image as a man who got things done, which made it politically costly for any mayor or governor to oppose him. By the time the Cross Bronx Expressway was proposed, Moses had accumulated so much institutional power that challenging one of his projects required a level of political courage that few elected officials possessed. The Cross Bronx Expressway would be the most consequential of all his projects, and the most destructive. Moses designed the expressway in 1948. It would be roughly 6.5 miles long, cutting east to west across the entire borough, connecting the George Washington Bridge to the highways leading to New England and Long Island. It would carry 6 lanes of traffic, and it would be the first large-scale highway ever built through a dense urban environment in the United States. Every expressway Moses had built before had gone through open land, or along waterfronts, or through areas that were already cleared. The Cross Bronx would go through the middle of living neighborhoods, apartment buildings, shops, schools, synagogues, churches. Tens of thousands of people lived directly in its path. The financial logic behind the project was a deal that cities across America were making in the post-war years. and that most would come to regret. The federal government, first through the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944, and then massively through the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, offered to pay 90 cents of every dollar spent on qualifying highway construction. The city and state would cover the remaining 10 cents. It was, on paper, an extraordinary bargain, a way to build major infrastructure at a fraction of the cost. The catch, though it was not described as a catch at the time, was that the money could only be spent on highways, not on mass transit, not on housing, not on parks. Highways. Moses understood the deal perfectly. If you wanted federal money, you built roads. And so he built roads. Construction began in 1948, starting on the less densely populated eastern stretches near Throg's Neck. By 1952, several sections were complete. But the heart of the project, the segment that would cut through the dense neighborhoods of East Tremont, West Farms, and Morris Heights, had barely been touched. And it was here that the story of the Cross Bronx Expressway became the story of one specific community's destruction. East Tremont, in the early 1950s, was a neighborhood of about 60,000 people. It was predominantly Jewish, with significant Irish and Italian populations and growing numbers of black and Puerto Rican residents, one of the most integrated neighborhoods in the city. The apartments were old but spacious, the rents were low, and the streets were lined with small businesses, bakeries, butcher shops, candy stores, tailors. There were pickle barrels on the sidewalks outside the delis on East Tremont Avenue and awnings over fruit stands where women stopped on the way home from work. Many of the men worked in the garment industry in Manhattan and rode the subway home at night to find their kids playing stickball between parked cars. There was a large and popular park, Crotona Park, at the neighborhood's southern edge, with an outdoor swimming pool that drew thousands on summer afternoons. The schools were good. The community was tight. People had come from the Lower East Side and from East Harlem, and they intended to stay. Robert Caro, in his monumental biography of Moses, the power broker, devoted 2 entire chapters to this 1 mile of highway and described the residents as liberals, utopianists, socialists, fiery radical labor unionists, people with the political instinct to fight and the organizational capacity to do it. In December 1952, letters began arriving at apartments throughout East Tremont. They were signed by Robert Moses. They informed the residents that their homes were to be demolished to make way for a new highway, and they had 90 days to vacate. The panic was immediate. Families who had lived in the same apartment for decades discovered that the rents anywhere else in the city were far beyond what they could afford. Committees formed. Residents visited the sections of the Bronx where the highway had already been built and saw what it left behind. Rubble, noise, a concrete trench that severed streets and cut neighbors off from one another. The city's housing department had done almost nothing to help displaced families find new homes. But the committees also found something that gave them hope, an alternative route. The residents hired an engineer, one who had previously worked for Moses himself, to study the highway's path. The engineer confirmed what seemed obvious on a map. If the expressway were shifted just 2 blocks to the south, it could run along the northern edge of Crotona Park through largely open land rather than through the heart of the neighborhood. Moses's route required the demolition of 159 buildings housing 1,530 families. The alternative route would have required the demolition of 6 buildings housing 19 families. According to Carroll, it would have saved $10 million in construction costs. The residents brought their plan to Moses. Neither he nor any of his aides would consider it. They brought it to the Bronx Borough President, James J. Lyons, who pledged his unwavering support. He declared he would stand with the residents 100% and fight the plan until hell freezes over. It must have been a particularly cold winter. At the decisive Board of Estimate hearing in 1953, Lyons voted in favor of Moses's original route. Moses had made clear the cost of opposition. He told the board that if the alternative route were approved, he would resign as city construction coordinator and, more critically, would cancel the federal funding for the entire project. State engineers who answered to Moses testified that the Crotona Park route would create curves of substandard radius and steep grades that could not meet federal approval standards. Whether those objections were legitimate engineering concerns or pretexts manufactured to justify a decision already made remains debated to this day. What is not debated is the result. On January 1st, 1954, the city took title to 159 buildings in East Tremont. The construction itself was an act of sustained violence against a living neighborhood. To build a highway through a place where 500,000 people lived, Moses essentially dug a trench, an open cut, in places 40 feet deep, blasted through bedrock, running between walls of raw stone and concrete. The blasting went on for years. Apartment walls cracked, windows shattered. Dust coated everything within blocks of the construction zone. At one point, the excavation passed directly beneath the Grand Concourse itself, requiring a 300-foot tunnel under the boulevard and the underground subway line that ran beneath it, an engineering feat that contributed to making this the most expensive stretch of road on Earth. The section through Tremont, a mere 6/10 of a mile, cost roughly $40 million per mile in 1950s money. The total cost of the Cross Bronx Expressway, originally estimated at under $39 million, ultimately reached $128 million. The final segment opened with the completion of the Alexander Hamilton Bridge in 1963. The project had taken 15 years. The immediate human toll was catastrophic. Estimates of the total number of people displaced by the expressway range from 40,000 to 60,000, depending on how broadly the displacement is defined. Caro documented that the families directly evicted from the East Tremont section received almost no meaningful relocation assistance. They scattered to other parts of the Bronx, to Upper Manhattan, to wherever they could find an apartment they could afford. The city's Tenant Relocation Bureau was underfunded and overwhelmed. Many families ended up in housing that was smaller, more expensive, and in worse condition than what they had left. But the displacement of those who lived directly in the highway's path was only the first wave of destruction. The second wave was slower, broader, and ultimately far more devastating. The Cross Bronx Expressway did not merely remove buildings, it severed neighborhoods. Streets that had connected communities for decades now dead-ended at a concrete wall. Shops lost their foot traffic. Churches lost their congregations. The physical continuity that makes a neighborhood function, the ability to walk from your apartment to the bakery, to the school, to the park, was broken. Property values in the blocks adjacent to the expressway collapsed almost immediately. The noise alone, tens of thousands of trucks and cars per day, the exhaust, the vibration, made the surrounding apartments less desirable overnight. What happened next followed a logic that was economic, demographic, and racial all at once, and it is impossible to separate the strands completely. The middle-class white families who had defined the Bronx for a generation began to leave. Some were pushed out by the highway itself. Others were drawn to the suburbs by government-backed mortgages that were, by deliberate policy, available almost exclusively to white borrowers. And starting in 1968, a powerful new magnet appeared within the borough itself. Co-op City, a massive cooperative housing development near the Westchester County border, which would eventually hold more than 15,000 apartments in 35 high-rise towers. It was built explicitly to attract the kind of middle-class families who had made the Grand Concourse what it was. And it succeeded. Tens of thousands of residents left the older neighborhoods for Co-op City's newer apartments, lower crime, and suburban feel. The departure was self-reinforcing. As middle-class families left, the businesses that served them closed, the tax base shrank, services deteriorated, and more families left. Redlining, the federal practice of rating neighborhoods by racial composition and denying loans to areas with significant black or Puerto Rican populations, meant that the families who moved in to replace those who left were largely shut out of the mechanisms of wealth building that their predecessors had used. The new residents were often poorer, they had fewer choices, and the buildings they moved into were increasingly neglected. This is where the economics became lethal. Landlords in the Bronx operated under New York City's rent control system, which capped how much they could charge. As the neighborhood's demographics shifted and property values fell, many landlords found themselves unable to cover the costs of maintenance, taxes, and mortgage payments. Some simply abandoned their buildings, walking away from properties that had become financial liabilities. Others discovered a more profitable exit: arson. The business model was grimly simple. A landlord would take out an insurance policy on a building. Then, often through intermediaries recruited from the neighborhood itself, the building would be set on fire. The landlord would collect the insurance payout and walk away. The tenants, the people who lived there, would be left with nothing. Sometimes there'd be a note delivered telling you the place would burn that night, one resident later recalled. Sometimes not. People got used to sleeping with their shoes on so that they could escape if the building began to burn. The fire department was overwhelmed. Companies in the South Bronx responded to so many calls that the runs blurred together. 4, 5, 6 fires a shift, night after night, for years. The city, reeling from its own fiscal crisis, actually closed fire companies in the Bronx during this period, a policy that the Housing Commissioner Roger Starr euphemistically called planned shrinkage. The idea, stripped of its bureaucratic language, was that certain neighborhoods were beyond saving, and the city should withdraw services and let them die. The residents who remained, overwhelmingly black and Puerto Rican, overwhelmingly poor, were left to watch their neighborhood consumed by fire while the city debated whether it was worth extinguishing. The fires began in the mid-1960s and accelerated through the 1970s into an epidemic without precedent in any American city not at war. Between 1973 and 1977, more than 44,000 fires were reported in the Bronx. At the peak, there were more than 40 fires a day. 7 census tracts lost more than 97% of their buildings to fire and abandonment between 1970 and 1980. Another 44 tracts lost more than half. Roughly 80% of the housing stock in the South Bronx was destroyed. An additional 250,000 people were displaced, on top of the tens of thousands already driven out by the highway. The population of the Bronx fell from 1,471,000 in 1970 to 1,168,000 in 1980, a loss of more than 300,000 people in a single decade. And then on the night of October 12, 1977, 60 million Americans watched it happen in real time. It was Game 2 of the World Series. The New York Yankees were playing the Los Angeles Dodgers at Yankee Stadium, the same stadium that had opened in 1923, the same year as the Concourse Plaza Hotel, on the same boulevard that Louis Reese had designed to be the Champs-Élysées of the Bronx. A few hours before the first pitch, a fire broke out in an abandoned school building, Public School 3, on the block bordered by Melrose and Cortlandt Avenues and 157th and 158th Streets. By the time the game was underway, the fire was still burning, and ABC's helicopter camera, hovering above the stadium, panned over to capture it. Flames were pouring from the windows of a building that no one had occupied for years, in a neighborhood where such fires had become so routine that they barely merited a phone call. Keith Jackson on the broadcast spoke first. That is a live picture, obviously a major fire in a large building in the South Bronx region of New York City. Howard Cosell, beside him, added, "That's the very area where President Carter trod just a few days ago." The camera returned to the fire 9 minutes later. Cosell noted that the fire department always had a hard job in the Bronx. Popular memory records Cosell as having said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning." He never said those words on the broadcast. The phrase had been in circulation since at least 1974, when it appeared as the title of both a New York Times editorial and a BBC documentary. But it hardly mattered. The image was the message. 60 million people watching a baseball game saw a borough on fire in the background, and the phrase attached itself to the image with the permanence of a caption. The Bronx was burning. Everyone could see it. A week before that broadcast, on October 5th, President Jimmy Carter's motorcade had made an unplanned stop on Charlotte Street in the South Bronx. The photographs from the visit show the president standing in a landscape that looks like post-war Berlin. Block after block of rubble, collapsed walls, empty lots where apartment buildings had stood, weeds pushing through cracked foundations. Charlotte Street had once been a working-class residential block, dense with 5-story walk-ups. By the time Carter stood on it, there was not a single inhabited structure in sight. He pledged $200 million in federal aid. Ronald Reagan visited the same spot during the 1980 presidential campaign, stood amid the same rubble, and asked, "I haven't seen anything that looks like this since London after the Blitz." It was an effective political image. Both men used the Bronx to make a point about the other's failures. The aid, when it eventually came, arrived slowly and unevenly. Charlotte Street itself was eventually rebuilt as a suburban-style development of prefabricated ranch houses, an almost surreal sight in the middle of the densest city in America. The Grand Concourse itself survived. The Art Deco buildings, for the most part, did not burn. They were too solid, too well built, too far from the worst of the destruction. But they emptied. The families who had lined up for those apartments in the 1930s and 1940s, the families for whom a lease on the concourse was evidence of moderate business success, were gone, scattered to Co-op City and Riverdale and the suburbs of Westchester and Long Island. The buildings remained, their lobbies still gleaming with terrazzo and brass, their facades still catching the light in the Art Deco patterns that Jacob Felsen and his contemporaries had designed a generation earlier. But the neighborhood around them had been hollowed out. The Concourse Plaza Hotel followed the trajectory of the borough it had once embodied. After its purchase by Joseph Caspi in 1965, it limped through the late 60s as crime rose and bookings fell. By the early 1970s, the city was desperate for shelter for welfare recipients displaced by the fires, and the hotel began accepting them at weekly rates that the manager promptly quadrupled. There were complaints of petty crime, a shooting. In 1974, the city acquired the building. Plans to convert it to senior housing stalled during New York's fiscal crisis, the same crisis that had led President Ford to famously refuse federal aid to the city, prompting the Daily News headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." The conversion finally happened in 1982. Today, the Concourse Plaza is a city-operated senior citizens' residence. Some of the people who moved in that year were elderly Bronxites who had been married in the hotel's grand ballroom decades earlier. The Lowe's Paradise Theater was divided into 2 screens in 1973, then 3, then 4. The cloud machine silenced, the twinkling stars hidden behind drop ceilings, the 4,000 seats partitioned into small, dingy auditoriums. The organ was removed in the 1960s and eventually installed at the Lowe's Jersey Theater across the river. The Paradise's interior was designated a New York City landmark in 2006, by which point the building was operating as a church. And the Cross Bronx Expressway kept running. It still does. It carries roughly 165,000 vehicles a day, including 18,000 trucks, on a road designed in the 1950s with no shoulders and outdated sight lines. 1 in 5 vehicles is a freight truck. It was named the most congested road in the United States for 4 consecutive years. The neighborhoods it passes through are among the poorest in New York City. The Bronx has the highest asthma rate in New York State, and the communities closest to the expressway have some of the worst air quality in the 5 boroughs. In 2022, New York City and State launched the Reimagine the Cross Bronx initiative, studying the possibility of capping sections of the highway, building parks and public space over the trench that Moses cut. 13 potential locations were identified. The estimated cost runs into the billions. As of this telling, the question of whether any of those caps will actually be built remains unresolved. A $900 million bridge rehabilitation project along the expressway is already generating fierce debate among residents and advocates who fear it will widen the highway's footprint. There is one more piece of the story, and it carries its own bitter irony. In the summer of 1973, while the Bronx burned around him, a Jamaican-born teenager named Clive Campbell, known as DJ Kool Herc, began hosting parties in the community room of an apartment building at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue, a few blocks from the Grand Concourse. Using 2 turntables and a sound system his father had helped him assemble, he experimented with extending the instrumental breaks of funk records, and his friends began rhyming over the loops he created. The art form that emerged from those parties, hip-hop, would become one of the most commercially successful and culturally dominant forces in the history of popular music. It was born in the ruins of exactly the neighborhood that Moses had destroyed. The building at 1520 Sedgwick was designated a historic site. The Cross Bronx Expressway runs a quarter mile to the south. The Grand Concourse is still 180 feet wide. Louis Reese's tree-lined medians are still there. Some of the Art Deco buildings have been landmarked. A few have been renovated. Gentrification is creeping into the southern portions, drawing young professionals who notice that the apartments have good bones, terrazzo floors, glass block windows, pre-war layouts, and that the 2 train will get you to Midtown in 20 minutes. The borough's population has rebounded somewhat, reaching nearly 1.5 million in the 2020 census, though the demographic composition is entirely different from what it was in 1950. But walk the concourse on a weekday afternoon, past the setback facades and the zigzag cornices, past the Bronx County Courthouse with its classical friezes, past the spot where the Concourse Plaza once hosted presidents and World Series heroes, and then keep walking east until you reach the point where the street grid simply stops, where the sidewalk ends and the concrete trench begins. 6 lanes of diesel exhaust and the unbroken roar of 165,000 vehicles. And the whole story is right there, written in the infrastructure. Louis Reese drew a line on a map in 1890, a boulevard to connect the Bronx to the world, and it created a neighborhood of extraordinary ambition. Robert Moses drew a different line on a different map in 1948, a highway to connect bridges to turnpikes, and he was offered an alternative that would have saved 1,500 families at no additional cost. He refused. And then the Bronx burned. The Grand Concourse is still there. The trench is still there. They are 3 blocks apart.